Good evening. I am here this evening to change the conversation. O siam siait, haksquile tenoya, Carolyn Roberts quinansna, Tanachcha tela sko omish okomeach, Tanachcha tela nakwakwa okomeach, and Tanachcha tela shiaktin okomeach. Chin kunman tomi, my heart is full. And I'm so thankful to be here this evening and sharing this beautiful stage with so many strong Indigenous women warriors. And I'm also very grateful for the space this evening for our voices to be heard. My birth mother is Janet Baker. She belongs to the Squamish Nation, but she originally comes from the Nakwakwa Nation, which is just up in Darcy, around the Anderson Lake area. My birth father is Stolo from the Shiaktin Nation, out in Chilliwack in the valley. And me, I belong to the Squamish Nation, up in North Vancouver. And my name is Carolyn Roberts. My birth name is Stacy Baker. And this complicated landscape that creates who I am here today in front of you is a very long story. My path has many twists and turns and curves. And it's difficult and it's hard to explain at times because of how deeply the colonial system, what I call the colonial disease, runs through me as all Indigenous people across Canada today. My story begins at birth. I'm a child of the 60s scoop. This was a governmental practice that was in place to remove Indigenous children from our homes and place them into non-Indigenous homes in order to assimilate us into the colonial system. Now, my birth mother was told that I had already been adopted out and that it would be in her best interest not to even hold me, because they didn't want her to have that connection to me. But what they didn't tell her is that I hadn't been adopted out. I was placed into the foster care system. I lived the first 3 months of my life in the foster care system, and then I was placed into my adoptive home. But I wasn't legally adopted to them until I was 5 years old. And now my adopted family was an all-white family in an all-white neighborhood, 800 kilometers away from my family, from my community, from my traditions, from my language. I had nobody to look up to as a young child, to know what it meant to be a Coast Salish woman. There was nobody there to guide me with teachings and knowledge or to teach me my language. And this isn't unlike the residential school system that removed us from our homes and stripped us of our identity. It wasn't until my early 20s that I reconnected with my community and my birth mother and my sisters, and I started this journey back to who I was meant to be. A Coast Salish woman warrior. Now, my adopted father brought us up in a home that was always talking about politics and what we could do in order for change to happen. We had to be active agents of change in order for this to happen. We couldn't just be a bystander in the process. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was the one that laid these roots that ground me here today, that make me strong, and that makes me want to fight for our Munmun, our children, so that they will be able to break free from these colonial chains that hold us back today. Now, our ancestors have always taught us to look 100 years from now, because what we do today affects 100 years from now. So now's the time for change. Because if we look at the system in place today, this governmental system in place today, by watching it, we can see it's not made for change. It only reacts or responds to change. And if we look at the history between Indigenous people and the government, we know that we, as Indigenous people, do not have a voice within this government. We do not have a seat at the table that creates change here in Canada. So this means we have to be the active agents of change in order for change to happen. And I'm not talking about trying to change the system that we have, or even trying to rebuild the system that we have. I'm talking about changing the conversation. I'm talking about creating a Canada like we have never seen before. One where Indigenous people are guiding its course, where we are rebuilding and reclaiming our land as we see fit for our future generations to come. So how are we going to do this? It is through our leadership that we can do this. And what good leadership does is it changes the conversations that we have. It changes what we talk about and how we talk about it. So let's change that. How do we, as Indigenous people, want our communities to run? And how do we want to set our Munmun, our children, how do we want to set them up for success? I think the biggest question that I have is, do we really want to continue to run our communities like the colonial system has set them up to run like? My great-grandfather was the hereditary chief of the Naquaqua Nation. The government came in and said, you are no longer the chief. You now have to run as a chief in council, and you have to be elected into this position. And my grandfather just said, well, that's not how we do things. Government did what they did. We now have a chief and council system in place, and they took an election. And our community spoke back in volumes and elected my great-grandfather as their chief. Yay! So, most of our communities across Canada today still run like this. Is this really the best way for our communities to run? Is this really the best way where our communities will be able to rebuild themselves? I wonder, and I ask wholeheartedly, how is the system in place today built for change for Indigenous people? What if we said no to the colonial state that we're in? What if we said we don't want to run like that? We want to run our own way. What if we made our own rules and guidelines to live by instead of trying so hard to live within the colonial guidelines and how they have set it up for us? What if? We know that this colonial system doesn't work for us, and we know that it's not going to change anytime soon. So why are we trying so hard to live within their guidelines? Why not make our own guidelines and make our own rules? That way we can dismantle this colonial settler state that we are in and create a new state, one built upon our traditions and our knowing. Because this colonial system, this colonial disease, has interrupted our history. And now is the time for change. We are at a critical moment in time when many of our nations across BC today are at the brink of losing their languages and what our languages hold for us. They hold our culture, they hold our traditions, they hold our identity and how our ancestors viewed the world. So now is the time for change. It is time to relook and to rethink and remember who we were, who we are and who we are meant to be as strong Indigenous people. Our ancestors fought to keep our languages and our traditions alive. And now we have thousands and thousands and thousands of generations within us. What are we going to do with that? How are we going to remember that? Our blood memory and the spirits of all of our ancestors are with us here today as we reclaim who we are as Indigenous people. We as Indigenous people do not need to figure out how to live within this colonial state. We need to create a new state, one that is built upon us as land protectors, as water protectors, a matriarchal society built upon strong community relationships. We have the opportunity today to live as our ancestors have guided us to be. It is with this generation and our leadership that we can reclaim who we are. It is time to break free, and it is time to change the conversation. Thank you. Thank you.